Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in Venezuela. It's been a few months since I last posted a video on Venezuela, and a lot has happened during that time. If you follow the channel, I'm sure you'll be aware that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves out of any country in the world. So you would have expected Venezuela to be a very rich nation. However, because of severe sanctions that have been applied against Venezuela since 2017, they've had a very limited market in terms of being able to export that oil and convert it into cash. And some of the reasons why the sanctions were actually applied against Venezuela in the first place were due to human rights violations and corruption and money laundering accusations. So the country hasn't been well run. However, in October 2023, the Joe Biden administration actually agreed to lift the sanctions against Venezuela for an initial period of 6 months. So it's now actually able to export again. And one of the reasons why the sanctions have been temporarily lifted is because there's an election coming up in 2024 in Venezuela. And the Venezuelan authorities have agreed that that can be internationally counted. So in today's video, I'll have a detailed look at what's been happening with the sanctions. We'll then talk about the forthcoming election because, as with any election campaign, the existing authorities have started changing their policies and becoming more generous. So we've got a new budget that's been submitted. We're talking about pay rises, and also one of the favourites when you're coming up for an election campaign is to start talking about a potential war. So we'll talk about what's going on between Venezuela and Guyana. We'll then have a look at what's going on with inflation, because Venezuela was the country with the highest rate of inflation in the world up until recently. However, it no longer has that accolade, and in fact, it's no longer the country in South America with the highest inflation. Argentina recently overtook it following the election of Javier Milei. We'll also talk about a recent prisoner swap that was undertaken between Venezuela and the USA. And interestingly, one of those prisoners that's been held by the USA has now been appointed as one of the ministers in Venezuela. So I'll give you the details on that, which is quite interesting because the guy was charged with money laundering and other offences, and he's now been put as head of investments in Venezuela. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen in Venezuela over the course of the next 3 to 6 months and what the implications will be for the Venezuelan economy. But before we get started on all of that, as always, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much. It means a lot to me. As I mentioned at the start of the video, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. And this chart gives you a visual representation of just how large those reserves are. The most recent forecast estimates that Venezuela still has over 300 billion barrels of oil in its reserves. And to put the scale of those oil reserves into perspective, Canada has around 170 billion barrels, Russia 80 billion barrels, and the USA 37 billion barrels. And as we know, despite the movement towards renewable energy and the move away from fossil fuels, oil remains the most valuable commodity in the world. All countries need to buy it. So as a result of the combination of large supplies and strong demand, you would have expected Venezuela to be doing very well. But unfortunately, Venezuela has shot itself in the foot twice over the last 50 years. In the 1970s, the Venezuelan government decided that it was a good idea to nationalise the whole of the oil industry. Up until that point, Venezuela had been working with multinational oil companies. They'd invited in companies from all around the world who'd invested heavily into the industry and developed Venezuela's oil fields. But once those fields were developed and working, Venezuela claimed all of them, and everybody that had put money into the country lost the whole of their investment. And obviously that didn't go down very well with those multinational oil companies, so they didn't want to invest a penny beyond that point. Now that would all be fine and dandy if Venezuela had looked after those assets and continued to develop them, but they didn't do that. And over the last 50 years, we have seen the production facilities starting to get older and more decrepit and fail in Venezuela. And they've gone from producing around 3 million barrels of oil per day at its peak to less than 800,000 today. And one of the reasons for that is because the equipment just isn't functioning well. But another factor has also been the loss of people, because the oil and gas industry is always developing. You need to stay at the cutting edge. We've spoken about this a lot when we've been talking about Russia. One of the problems that Russia is now facing is that the withdrawal of all of the multinationals that was seen following its invasion of Ukraine has led to the loss of people and investment. And the Russian oil industry is now going backwards. And that's exactly what's been happening in Venezuela over the last 50 years. So that was the first problem with the industry. But the second problem came in 2017, when Venezuela started to be hit by sanctions. Now, initially, those sanctions were related to human rights violations and corruption. Senior officials in the Venezuelan government, amongst other people, were identified as allowing things like money laundering, drug trafficking, and corruption to go on whilst they turned a blind eye. And alongside the sanctions that were being applied against individuals, Venezuelan companies also started to be sanctioned. Then in 2018, the last election was undertaken and President Maduro won that election. However, there was wide-scale accusations that he had rigged the election. And as a direct result of that, the Trump administration in the USA, alongside the European Union and a variety of other countries, applied sanctions directly against the oil industry. So the national company, PDVSA, which runs the whole of the oil industry in Venezuela, was hit with sanctions, which meant that a lot of its export markets were lost overnight. It was estimated at that point that Venezuela was exporting around $11 billion worth of oil directly to the USA. So it lost that market, and it also lost access to all of the tankers that were insured and owned by countries from the West. So very similar to what we've been talking about for Russia and its sanctions. And as a result of those sanctions, the Venezuelan oil industry went into serious decline, and so did the economy of the country. However, things have recently started to change for two reasons. Firstly, because of all of the sanctions that are being applied against Russia, and also the cutbacks that OPEC Plus have announced to try to keep the price of oil high, the USA has started reconsidering the ban against Venezuela, because if the Venezuelan oil supplies can start coming back into general circulation, it keeps supply up and therefore keeps price down. So there's a supply and demand issue. But alongside that, the US authorities have also brokered a deal directly with the current president of Venezuela, President Maduro, whereby he's agreed that the next election, which is going to be held later in 2024, can be monitored and counted by an independent international body. So basically, this should be a fair election. And alongside that agreement, President Maduro also agreed to lift the ban on all of the election candidates, because up until this point, nobody was actually allowed to run against him. So as a result of those two agreements, on the 18th of October 2023, the US authorities signed a deal with Venezuela, allowing it to export oil anywhere it liked. So you might be expecting the lifting of that ban to be a sea change for Venezuela, to be able to put its economy back on track. But as we've just discussed, the oil industry in Venezuela has not been well invested over the last 50 years. As a result of nationalising all of those assets, it's been left to its own devices. And because the economy has gone to rack and ruin, so has the oil industry. So it's going to be very difficult for Venezuela to be able to turn things around without being able to attract in overseas investment. And interestingly, the Venezuelan authorities have recently stated that they would now like overseas companies to come to Venezuela and start investing again. And it'll be very interesting to see whether or not anybody wants to do that, because a lot of people had their fingers very badly burned in the 1970s. Following the easing of sanctions against Venezuela, it was announced that Venezuela has now signed a deal with Shell and the National Gas Corporation of Trinidad and Tobago to develop one of its natural gas fields. The licence provides for an initial output of 185 million cubic feet per day of gas, which will be sent to Trinidad for producing liquefied natural gas and petrochemicals. These offshore gas fields were discovered by PDVSA over 10 years ago. However, due to the fact that they didn't have any commercial partners who could provide the capital to build all of the infrastructure, they've been unable to develop those fields any further. Now, this agreement is obviously a positive development from Venezuela's point of view, and I think it's interesting that these fields are offshore. They're not actually on Venezuelan soil, and so it would be much more difficult for Venezuela to be able to seize these assets. And I think realistically, they're the only sort of deals that companies like Shell and other multinational oil and gas companies will be prepared to sign in the short term, because if there is a rescinding of this agreement from the USA to lift the sanctions, then obviously that could potentially kill this deal stone dead. So I would expect that we won't see heavy investment over the next few months from Shell and Trinidad and Tobago. They'll be waiting to see whether or not the sanctions are lifted on a longer term basis before committing billions of dollars. This chart shows the rate of inflation in Venezuela over the last 12 months. And as you can see, inflation hit a high of 440%, which is off the scale. That was the highest rate of inflation in the world at that point. Now, between February and August 23, inflation did come down slightly, but by August it was still sitting at 395%, still off the scale and still the highest in the world. However, over the last 4 months, there has been some minor progress. And in December 2023, the official rate of inflation was recorded at 190%, which still ranks Venezuela as the country with the third highest inflation rate in the world. However, it's no longer the highest in South America, because Argentina recorded inflation of 211% in December. And clearly, when you have inflation at these sort of levels, it's completely unmanageable from a personal point of view. Unless your wages are increasing at the same rate as prices, your standard of living will be falling significantly. And just to put that point into perspective, this chart shows the movement in food inflation in Venezuela over the last 12 months. And you can see that in March 23, it hit a high of 489%. Which basically means that year on year, the price of food on average had increased by around 5 times, and nobody's wages were increasing at anything like that rate. Now, in a similar way to what we just talked about for general inflation, food price increases have slowed down. However, in December 2023, they were still increasing by more than 172% year on year. Now, one of the ways that the people in Venezuela have been trying to avoid the impact of these high levels of inflation is by abandoning the currency bolivar and using the US dollar instead. And that's what the vast majority of transactions are now being done in. But the problem that public workers have is that they're being paid directly by the state, and they are forced to be paid in bolivars. So that means that every single month, as they see prices going up, the value of those bolivars is going down. And to make matters worse, as inflation continues rising, the value of the bolivar in terms of the exchange rate against the dollar continues falling. And there have recently been mass protests on the streets of Venezuela from public workers such as teachers, who are paid on average around 500 bolivars per month, which equates now to around $20. And that simply isn't enough to be able to survive on. And there are now lots of stories of teachers having to abandon the profession and take up things like hairdressing because they can be paid in US dollars, in cash, and therefore can have enough to actually survive. And I think these sort of stories really put what's going on in Venezuela into perspective. On the channel, we often talk about the potential for economies collapsing. And people ask me, what does that look like? Well, I think what we're seeing in Venezuela is exactly what it looks like. If you have all of your teachers who have degrees and professional qualifications deciding that being paid as a teacher is worse than going and doing a manual profession because you can be paid in cash and have more disposable income, the implication of that for your country and economy is that you could lose all of those teaching professionals, and therefore you won't have anybody to teach your next generation that are coming through. And that really does put your country into a very difficult situation. If you've got got an uneducated workforce coming through, then it's unlikely that they're going to help you develop and grow the economy significantly. So little things like this really give you a flavour as to what happens when an economy and a country starts to break down. And it's very difficult to be able to rebuild that overnight. As we've now got an election coming up, President Maduro has turned his mind to what's happening amongst the public sector workers, and he recently announced a 43% increase in the minimum wage in Venezuela. All public workers will get a monthly supplement of $60, as well as $40 in food stamps on top of their base salary. But unfortunately, from President Maduro's point of view, that isn't really going to solve the problem. And the president of the Teachers Federation in Venezuela recently stated that salaries in teaching need to increase 25 times to around $550 per month in order for those teachers just to be able to survive, to be able to pay their bills and put food on the table. So the announcement of a 43% increase in the minimum wage is miles away from where it needs to be. As I mentioned at the start of the video, a war is always good if you're looking to gather support for an election. Lots of different people have done this in the past. If you're a leader of a country and you start talking about war with one of your neighbours, then generally that increases the feeling of nationalism and people start to get behind you. And that's exactly what President Maduro has done recently. He's reignited a long-standing dispute between Venezuela and its neighbour Guyana, which used to be referred to as British Guyana. It was part of the British Empire, and interestingly, it's the only country in South America that has English as its native language as a result of that. And Venezuela claims that when the British took over Guyana, they took a large area of land called Essequibo that was part of Venezuela, and Venezuela now wants it back. And what makes this conflict more interesting is that the land and the coastal waters that are in dispute are rich in resources. There is a lot of oil, gas and diamonds in this area. Now, Guyana has actually been independent since 1966, so the British are no longer directly involved in this dispute. However, following the recent announcements that President Maduro wants this land back, the UK government sent one of its warships to the area and said that it would support Guyana in these discussions. And it's recently been announced that Venezuela have deployed over 5,000 soldiers to the area. And President Maduro appeared on Venezuelan TV stating Venezuela has the right to defend itself, to tranquility, to peace. Venezuela's Navy commander Neil Villamizar said 5,682 military personnel from several components of Venezuela's armed forces were deployed, along with 3 ocean patrol vessels, 3 multi-purpose vessels, 7 missile boats, 8 amphibious vehicles and over 20 fighter planes. Whilst the troops deployed represent only around 4% of Venezuela's estimated military force, it matches the number of Guyana's estimated combatants. As part of the new concessions between the USA and Venezuela, the two countries recently were involved in a prisoner swap, where Venezuela handed over 10 prisoners, including somebody called Fat Leonard that the US authorities wanted back. And in exchange for those 10 prisoners, President Maduro received back one of his allies, an individual called Alex Saab. Alex Saab is a Colombian businessman who was indicted by the USA in July 2019 on federal money laundering charges. He was accused of bribing Venezuelan officials and funneling more than $350 million to overseas accounts as part of a food program intended to serve those going hungry in Venezuela. It was claimed that Saab ran a network of shell companies that brought assembled and shipped food to Venezuela for a food program that was called CLAP. Saab's relationship with the Venezuelan government made him one of the region's most powerful men, and it's alleged that Saab worked with the members of the government to sell Venezuelan gold to Turkey in exchange for food. Saab was detained in Cape Verde in June 2020 when his private plane stopped to refund while flying from Venezuela to Iran. He was then extradited to the USA where he faced corruption charges. And interestingly, despite the fact that he was facing huge international corruption charges, upon his release and return to Venezuela, President Maduro has now appointed him as the head of Venezuela's International Investment Center. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because it's been a little while since I did an update on Venezuela, and it's interesting to see what's going on in the economy. And obviously there have been some major developments over the last few months, and the biggest one out of all of them has been the releasing of the sanctions applied directly against Venezuela by the USA. Venezuela is now able to freely trade its oil. That is a potential lifesaver for both the country and the economy. But as we've discussed in today's video, it's simply impossible for Venezuela to be able to ramp up its oil production overnight to be able to benefit from the lifting of these sanctions. In the past, Venezuela was producing around 3 million barrels of oil per day, and at a price of around $80, that represents a huge amount of potential income. However, today the country is producing around 800,000 barrels per day, and it's exporting around 95% of that already. It's sending the majority of it to China and other countries that are not partaking in the sanctions against Venezuela. So in a similar fashion to what we're seeing with Russia, Venezuela has managed to find an outlet for its oil, so it's still receiving some income, albeit at lower rates because it's not selling at the same price as the rest of the world. It's having to discount to encourage people to buy from it. So a very similar story to what we're talking about for Russia all round. But where Venezuela is really struggling is that over the last 50 years, there hasn't been a lot of investment going into the oil and gas industry because it killed off all of the overseas investment when it decided to nationalize all of those assets. It was a short-term gain for a long-term pain from Venezuela's point of view. And in some respects, there are a lot of parallels to what's happening in Russia right now, because Russia has done a very similar thing. All of the multinationals who invested into Russia have had their fingers burned. They've lost all of those assets. And that's been great from Russia's point of view initially. But over the next 5 to 10 years, Russia may find itself in a very similar situation to where Venezuela is now. And even though Venezuela now has access to the markets, it's going to be very difficult to persuade international companies to come and reinvest into the country because the same thing could happen again. If you're Shell or ExxonMobil or BP, would you sign off on a multi-billion-dollar investment in Venezuela when in 3 or 4 years' time you could quite easily see that investment being written down to zero if the Venezuelan authorities say, thank you very much, actually everything's working really well now, so we're going to nationalise these new assets as well. The deal that we talked about earlier in this video, where Shell have signed a deal with the Trinidad and Tobago National Gas Company, that is offshore, so potentially it's more protected. It's less likely that Venezuela will try to seize those assets. So potentially that deal might work, but let's see, because it's very early stages. They've just signed the license. They haven't actually started investing any capital yet. I'm guessing that they'll want to wait and see that the sanctions are lifted permanently before they start investing heavily into that region, because otherwise there is a real risk that the USA reimpose the sanctions and they won't be able to actually export any of the gas, even if they do manage to develop it. But the lifting of the sanctions is obviously the first step on the road to recovery from Venezuela's point of view. And the next step is the election that's coming up in the second half of 2024. Now, up until this point, President Maduro was seen as being a dictator. One of the reasons why the sanctions were put into place was it was seen that the election in 2018 was completely rigged, that nobody else had a chance. So in order for Venezuela to be able to move further down the road of recovery, they're going to have to show a pair of clean heels. They will need to prove that this election was completely fair, that candidates can stand against President Maduro, and that the ballot boxes will be completely fairly counted. Everybody will have the chance to vote for whoever they want. Now, as it stands at the moment, the agreement is that the election will be monitored by an independent international agency. So we'll have to see how that plays out. And as it stands in the unofficial polls right now, it's likely that if that goes through, that President Maduro will lose power. So it will be interesting to see whether or not he sticks with all of these agreements, or if he decides to change his mind and we see the sanctions being put back into place and an unfair election takes place. But obviously that will play out in the later part of 2024. But the overall summary of today's video is that Venezuela is still struggling. We saw from the inflation figures earlier that inflation is still in triple figures, and President Maduro, as one of his election campaign policies, has said that he's aiming to bring it back down into double figures, so it might get down to 99%, which is obviously still off the scale. And the economy in Venezuela is in dire straits. The vast majority of people are now using dollars. The only people who are not using dollars, who are using bolivars, are those who are forced to because they're being paid in bolivars, and they're the ones who are living at or below the breadline. They can't afford to put food on the table. So this situation can't continue. Something needs to be done. It's likely that we will need to see a change of power. We'll need to see somebody else being voted in as president before we see anything radical happening. And it's likely that any changes will take a long period of time. If you follow the channel, you'll know that we've been talking about Argentina. They've recently voted in a new president, Javier Milei. He's got radical policies. It's a complete revolution from an economic point of view, but that won't happen overnight. It's likely to get worse before it gets better. And I think from Venezuela's point of view, it's the same situation. We're not going to see an immediate turnaround, even though the sanctions have been lifted. They need to reinvest into the oil industry. They need to change their policies. They need to start investing into their public sectors. Things like healthcare workers and teachers are underpaid. They're struggling to be able to survive. All of that needs to change before Venezuela can start rebuilding, and that's going to take a long period of time. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.